What's up, guys? So today I want to show you what I think a beginner hobbyist should have in their RC tool collection, and then also what an intermediate, and then also maybe a person who's been in the hobby for a while or is serious about the hobby should have. This is just my opinion, so take it for what you want it to be, but I feel like these are the main things that you should have. So to start with, a beginner, one of the things, and this is not like this is a pretty obvious thing, but you want to get a dedicated set of Allen drivers. This is crucial. Now, these are not expensive ones. This was only like a $15 set off of Amazon. You don't have to go too expensive to begin with. Uh, Usually you get a good, decent, cheap set and they will last you a while. I have had very little issues with these, and they fit pretty dang snug inside like the socket of a screw. One thing that I wouldn't say stay away from, but don't stick with, is these kits that you get at hobby stores. They're all right, but the main problem you run into is the bit material. It wears away quick. It doesn't last long. You try and put a ton of torque, it will even strip out inside of here, so they don't grip the hex shape very well. I do like them for the flathead and the socket and the Phillips heads, because this is pretty good for tuning cars or just doing small adjustments or prying on things or something. And it is kind of nice for doing quick work because it has the ratchet function. So I wouldn't stay away from this. In fact, I say have one of these, because this does carry enough stuff to kind of be good enough to get away with stuff. But I would certainly say that you should have a set of dedicated drivers, because then you're not switching between bits in that set. You have a screwdriver for each size. Moving on, you need a good pair of needle nose pliers. This is a high quality pair of needle nose pliers, and you will use these a lot. They come in handy because they have wire cutters, and they're nice for if you drop a screw in an RC car, you can grab it if you have big fingers. These are handy all the stinking time, and this you should always have a good pair of needle nose pliers. Next up is kind of decent, but yet kind of a screwdriver that you don't care about too much, a flathead. This is good for prying on stuff if you get something stuck, or I use these to put grease on gears sometimes. Then I don't have to get my fingers greasy. Just having a screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, is handy for a lot of things, and I use this all the time, and it gets abused all the time. As you can see, it's even a little bit bent. So it's nice to have something like this, because you don't have to worry about it too much, and if you bend it, break it, or whatever, it's not that big of a deal. Next is a small pen flashlight. These are extremely handy when you're working on stuff or you need a little bit more light. I got one that has an adjustable beam and has high and low. This, again, is a necessity for RC hobbyists. I mean, I use this thing all the time, especially when working on cars. It just comes in extremely helpful when you need a little bit more light in an area. The last thing that I'd say is a must-have, and this is probably one of the first things you should get too, is a cell checker. Now, you don't have to get a too high-quality one, because mainly what you're going to be using this for is checking the percentage of your lipos and making sure that they're safe and balanced. This is kind of just a main thing that you will always use to make sure your lipo's at the correct storage voltage and that they're balanced. One feature that these have that, if you're new into the hobby, you may not know, is they can check internal resistance, and that kind of tells you kind of a rough estimate on how good the battery is, like if it has much life left in it or if it's on its way out. Now, this is where getting an expensive cell checker will matter, because these cheap ones do not have their reading is not too accurate on the internal resistance. They usually, on mine, usually one cell will be off, and it'll tell me that it's off even when I get a brand new battery, and I've checked multiple times, and all the times it's pointed to the cell checker being off and the battery is actually fine. So that is one thing where these matter, but a beginner hobbyist is never really going to mess with that too much, and I don't even mess with it too much. So it's kind of just an extra feature that you won't use that often, but you have it available. One other thing before we move on is I have these neodymium magnets on the 2 screwdrivers I use the most, and sometimes these come with a little magnetic charge already, but it's extremely weak. By having this magnet on there, it allows you to hold screws good enough that you can actually hold this upside down and shake it, and the screws won't fall off, which makes it nice for reaching those tight spots where you can't get your finger to hold the screw on the end of this. So that's another thing to keep in mind. It's not necessarily a beginner item. I'd say it's more intermediate, but it is well worth the cost. You can pick up a small pack of neodymium magnets at Harbor Freight for a couple bucks. So that's something that I would recommend for how cheap it is. Okay, next up, we have quite a bit of stuff, and this is something I would recommend if you've been into the hobby for a little while and you are pretty certain that you're going to stay in the hobby. This is stuff that I wouldn't necessarily get if you're a beginner, especially if you're not sure if you're set in the RC hobby, but if you are, these are some items I would recommend having. Start off with, I think, we'll start with this stuff. Having spare screws and hardware. This stuff is nice when you strip out a screw or something like that, or you need a screw that's a little bit longer or something. Having spare screws on hand is a must for people who have been in the hobby for a while, because after you've been in it for a while, the screws on your cars start stripping out, they start getting rusty or something. It's nice to always have these on hand, so when you're doing maintenance and you found a bad screw, you can replace it right then. And then you don't have to go to the hobby store and buy a small pack of 10 and spend $2 on a pack of 10 when you can spend like $16 on a whole set of flathead and socket cap screws, or inset and socket cap screws in all different lengths. Now, this is not the box that came, or this is not like the storage container that the screws came in, but I found this little storage thing and it works great for all these screws. I prefer to run socket cap screws, I believe they're called, instead of, I believe they're called button head. The button heads are like the rounded top one. The button heads have their use, but a lot of the times I find that the socket cap screws, first of all, they usually run a 2.5 millimeter hex instead of a 2 millimeter hex, which is a lot harder, in my opinion, to strip out than a 2 millimeter hex, and they have they're deeper inset, which also makes them harder to strip out. To me, they're just a better screw than the button heads. Now, the button heads, again, have their uses because they're rounded, but a lot of the times, in most cases, the socket cap screws will do fine in those scenarios. Then, moving on underneath them, is I have a metric nut and washer kit. This is mainly for, like, on my Arrma Kraton. It has pieces where you have a screw and a nut that holds like a tie rod on, or like a link on, and those are nice for if you round off a nut or it kind of loses the plastic in its lock nut part. If it loses the nylon, that helps it be a lock nut. That's always handy to have on, and mainly you realize this stuff when you're doing your car maintenance and then you find those bad screws or bad nuts. Then, carrying on with kind of hardware, one thing that I put off way too long that I recommend is getting a mini wrench set. This is especially useful when you're adjusting your tie rods or your toe links. Then you don't have to fiddle around with some pliers or a small adjustable wrench. These are super handy because then you just pick a size and you always have it. And when you're turning your turnbuckles, these save a lot of time. Again, I waited quite a while to get these, and I have nothing but regrets when it comes to that. This is a cheap $10 set on Amazon, and that's probably all you're going to need. Another thing when it comes to maintenance I would recommend is a bearing kit. find a bearing kit that fits your car. This one's for my Kraton, and again, when you're doing maintenance and you're checking your bearings, it's frustrating to have to order bearings and wait for them to come in to get your car up and running. By having a bearing kit on hand, you can automatically get your car up and running regardless of what happens to it or what bearing goes out. This is not a super expensive brand. I haven't had problems with them, but I would definitely say fast eddy bearings are the way to go, not these like Chinesium Fuji bearings or whatever. Then, of course, Loctite. When you start doing maintenance and you have screws that go in the metal, you're going to want Loctite. I only use blue Loctite. I never use red because I don't have to use heat to remove screws, but that is a necessity. This small container has lasted me, the small tube has lasted me quite a while, and there's quite a bit left in it. This stuff, I've heard some people say, oh, Loctite goes bad. Don't listen to them. At least I don't, because I've had this stuff for a couple years, and it's not gone bad on me yet. Having a scalpel knife or X-Acto knife, depending on what you call them, these are handy for when your pocket knife just can't quite do the job. You can do a little finer work, and just sometimes I've used them to kind of trim plastic for clearances or something like that. They have their uses, and they come handy in times when you need them. Next up, I have a body reamer. This is nice, not always for just reaming body holes out. I haven't used it really at all for that, but if you're trying to ream a hole out in plastics or something, or you're making like a custom part, this comes really handy for doing stuff like that. And I've even used this stuff for other stuff that's not related to my RC hobby. It just comes in handy all the time. Next up, I have servo mounting tape or ESC mounting tape. I don't like to use this stuff on my ESCs because it does not hold very well. But the Gorilla double-sided foam tape works really well, especially like their 50-pound hold per square inch works extremely well, and I haven't had a problem with that letting go on my ESCs. Then, last but definitely not least, are little storage containers. These are especially handy when you're working on your car and you have screws that go to certain parts, or you're trying to keep track of what goes what. This is just really handy for doing that stuff. They are also handy for if you're doing shock work. Now, me personally, I rarely do it, but when I do save shock oil, like if I've just changed a shock, or if I accidentally put too much shock oil, or I don't know, just something happens and I want to reuse the shock oil, I can pour the shock oil into here, and then I can dump it right back in to the shock because it has a perfect pouring. It's really nice for pouring shock oil. It works really well. I use these all the time when I'm doing stuff because they can just keep track of stuff, especially if you work on something one day, you take a break and you come back to it. This is nice so if somebody walks by, they don't accidentally knock all your screws onto the floor, especially when having a lid. Also, having a tray with the magnet on the bottom is pretty useful for bigger screws, but for my small stuff, I always stick to this, because then by the time you snap the lid on, the stuff inside of it's not going anywhere. Whereas this, sometimes if you have something that's not magnetic or something, this parts dish, it's kind of 50-50 on how much I use it. I like to use these more. But that's about it for the intermediate items. And again, guys, this is stuff that if you are committed to the RC hobby, I would say this is something you should get almost right away once you're sticking with it and you're not going to drop the hobby. Okay, and for my last items, this is stuff that I would say if you got a little extra money, or if you've been in the RC hobby and you don't quite know what you're missing yet, these are some things that you might consider. Now, I think I'll start off probably with this. This is a homemade LiPo battery discharger. And the reason I made this is most LiPo chargers cannot discharge a LiPo battery at that high of an amperage. And so I wanted to make something that I could easily and quickly discharge my batteries. Now all this is it's just a bunch of 12-volt light bulbs right here, and I found that they pull roughly around 2 amps a piece, so I have 3 of them pulling about 6 amps that I found out, and this will discharge, again, at 6 amps. That's probably going to discharge most batteries I run in about an hour, which is much faster than my charger can do. My charger can only discharge, at kid you not, a third of an amp, which is pretty depressing. And the reason this is useful is I am not a person to run my cars in the rain or in wet, muddy conditions, and so when I charge my batteries up and I end up not using them because the day didn't turn out how I planned it to, this comes in handy for returning my batteries back to storage levels. And this is just a simple, quick project I put together. Nothing simple. It's just 3 light bulbs in series. I just have the red wire soldered to the sides of the light bulbs, and then the black wire just gets soldered to the bottom of the light bulbs. Very simple, yet very effective. And now the bulbs do get hot when you run them, and I don't know, I'm not one, I don't like to run it hot for too terribly long, but this is just really helpful when you have batteries that you're trying to discharge, because you can get it done in a relatively timely manner. Next up, I'll say this is pretty fine work, and this I've used mostly for my SCX24, but a set of micro drill bits. There's also some in this thing right here, but oh man, have these things come in handy. If you 3D print plastic parts, you can drill holes itty bitty for screws to go into if your print malfunctions or something like that. I also have a 3D pen, which is like you can make 3D printed parts essentially, but it just fits in your hand and you have to hand do them, so the parts don't always turn out too accurate. So that's when the screws come in handy. I've also used them for just drilling holes in plastic, to just in other pieces of plastic for maybe an ESC mount or something like that. They come in handy for when you need to make a small hole, and you will not regret getting them, because when you use them, you really appreciate their usefulness. Then another thing I have here is a temp gun. Now, I had this given to me by a buddy, so I can't speak a whole lot on cost-wise and quality-wise. I know this is a fairly good quality one, and sometimes it can be kind of expensive if you get a high-quality one. But this is really useful for those people trying to tune their cars properly, whether it be nitro RC cars and making sure it doesn't get too hot, or electric cars and finding out which pinion gear you can run without running the risk of melting your motor. This is very simple, has a button there to switch between Celsius and Fahrenheit, and it has a laser, and you just point it with wherever you want it to take the temperature. The closer you get to the surface, the better, but it does work from a pretty good distance. But this is especially handy, again, for checking your motor temperatures and stuff like that. Now, the last, or not quite the last thing, you guys will see, but the second to last thing I have here is a scale. Now, this isn't too helpful. It's not really that useful when you're running, if you're just into bashers, but if you're in the crawlers, I would say you almost have to have a scale if you're wanting to make your crawler perform better. Then you can actually weigh your crawler accurately and find like a balance between front and rear weight ratio. Now, I know they sell RC scales out there that have like 4 individual scales that go under each wheel, but a set of those will cost you close to $100, and buying just a good quality scale for $20-$30 will save you money, but also provide you with those readings to tune your car properly. Now, for my last item, I'm going to have to make room, and you guys will see why. So what I have here, I'll take you guys off the tripod, is my toolbox. Having a good big toolbox that is portable, I'd say, is very important. Now, the reason being is I actually store almost all my RC tools inside of this, and this allows me to, when I go out bashing, I can take almost all my tools with me and some spare parts to where I'm going, and then if something breaks or if something happens, I have all the tools necessary to fix my car. I always keep my bearing kits in here because nothing ruins a day like going out and bashing and then having a bearing go out in the first 5 minutes. That is frustrating right there. It's like an oversized ammo can. Has this little storage thing up here. This is where I keep grease, WD-40, a little toothbrush that comes in handy, a magnet stick, a wire brush, and some zip ties. Then there's also a tray that goes in here, but I also have plenty of room for other tools, and this has come in extremely helpful. In fact, if you are the type of person to bring your whole toolbox with you, you can help some other people who haven't brought tools with them. I know a couple times I've been out bashing and somebody's broke their rig or something and all they needed was a screw, and luckily I keep my screwdrivers and screws in here, so I was able to get them back up and running and save their day as well as mine. So it's kind of neat to be that person who can help somebody else and help keep their day going good. But just having a big toolbox that you can keep stuff organized but yet carry all your stuff in is very important if you start going places. But again, I'd say this is I don't necessarily say you need to be a beginner or if you're just getting into the hobby, but if you've been in the hobby for a while and you don't have a nice toolbox that's portable, you should consider getting one. And I've tested a couple toolboxes, and so far I found one like this is pretty nice because it has small areas to keep greasy stuff out of the rest of the toolbox, yet it's watertight, and you can keep like little electronic boards like a cell checker or something in here without them getting ruined. And you can keep your small stuff up top and your big stuff in the bottom. So I'd say this is probably one of my favorite items that I have, and I've had it for a couple years and am not disappointed in it. You can even lock it down, and I don't use this to keep people out of it because it's not going to do crap, but it's helpful if you're going places to keep the toolbox from opening during travel and spilling its contents everywhere. That is also frustrating. But that's probably it for today, guys. If you guys have any suggestions, because maybe there's stuff I haven't found that I'd like to have, but that's really all. So thanks for watching. Appreciate it.